If you listen, you can hear American history. You can even dance to it. It's jazz, and it's as full of soul and promise as the great country that gave birth to it. Jazz is all about democracy, individuals coming together, exchanging traditions, and adopting new ideas to create new harmonies and new expressions of freedom like the world it never heard before. Jazz is more than America's music. Jazz is America.
I don't think it's possible to study social history in the United States without recognizing jazz as one of the central phenomena.
Jazz is an absolutely critical part of American history. It's actually, well, obviously it's an art form that was created here in the United States, and I think that it's an art form that could have only been created here in the United States.
This is music that came up out of a necessity for survival, and so it speaks about humanity in a very deep way. Some of the things that are most beautiful come out of some of the most horrible things.
Jazz grew out of the African American community at the turn of the 20th century, a time when blacks were being denied their most basic rights.
So in the case of the Afro-American, of course, it's natural that they would bring the American message that would be objectified in an art form because they were the ones who were denied freedom the most. When you're treated unjust, when you're treated with that level of degradation and you're abused to that level, your concept of freedom would be much greater. It's like to a blind person, seeing is something much more magnificent than a person who can see.
People from everywhere came and went to New Orleans, bringing in their own styles of music, from Midwestern ragtime and parading funeral bands to European opera and the African drums heard every Sunday in Congo Square. All the ingredients of jazz met and mixed in the streets of New Orleans.
When you think back to the early 1850s in New Orleans, when you had this sort of mixing of all these different cultures of people from the West Indies, and you had people from Italy and from all across Europe, all coming together in this one space, of course, with people of African descent as well. All these different cultures living in close proximity. It's really an early form of integration, though they weren't, buddy-buddy.
So now you have this one city. It was founded by the French. It was developed by the Spanish. It's an American city. It sits where the Gulf of Mexico meets the mouth of the Mississippi River. You got all kind of Americans coming down the Mississippi. It's central to the slave trade. You have all types of slaves. You have all kind of people coming from the second largest port in the United States of America. It's also more integrated than any other city in the South, in America, because the people all live close to each other. It's below sea level. The air is heavy, okay? All of that is happening in one place, and it's not a big place.
African Americans added 3 fresh strains to the city's already rich musical mix. Ragtime was first heard in black neighborhoods in Midwestern cities, syncopating and rearranging every kind of music to create livelier, more danceable versions. At about the same time, black refugees from the cotton fields of the Mississippi River Delta began streaming into the city. With them, they brought the blues, the musical style that reflected the trials and joys of everyday life. Then there was church music, similar to the blues, trying to find hope in a troubled world. Each was built around the same rhythms, the same moans and cries and bent notes. New Orleans cornet king Buddy Bolden was the first to understand that wonderful things would happen if you brought together the sounds of a marching band and the emotional power of the blues. Buddy delivered an enormously original sound using an inventiveness that had people flocking to see him.
He's from the church, so you can hear the sound of all the people shouting in the church. He knows the blues, so he sounds like a blues player. He's been playing dances and quadrilles and all these things, so he knows kind of the French music. He knows kind of arias and pieces, marching band tradition. He can play like that. He has the kind of feeling of the dances in the lowest form of clubs, and he's a virtuoso on his horn. Well, this person puts all of these things together and starts to improvise and make up his part. He doesn't want to read the music, he goes off the music. And when he starts to go off of the music, he's creating music that sounds like all of that music. That's what jazz is. Louis Armstrong taught people how to be modern because he was so supremely confident in his genius that he could be all the things at once. He could be a fool, he could be a genius, he could be the most sacred. He sang spirituals, he sang the dirtiest, most low-down blueses. He played the trumpet in a way that no one has ever played it. He played the most beautiful, pristine melodies. He sang romantic songs. He created masterpieces. He did everything you could possibly do.
Louis Armstrong, raised in a poor New Orleans neighborhood, became not only a legendary jazz musician, but a legendary American.
I don't think that there has been a person in music like that, like him, and he is the embodiment of jazz.
Segregation may have governed even the smallest details of daily life, but it would never be able to keep real musicians from listening to and learning from one another in New Orleans or anywhere else.
The reason that there's always been a question of jazz is because of race. And that's why it is jazz, because jazz came to tell you the race is not the issue. The issue is, what does it mean to be an American? And that anybody can be one if they are one.
In the 1920s, jazz spread rapidly all across America, marking a new era called the Jazz Age. Chicago became the main destination for many early jazz musicians. The city was fertile ground for people from the segregated South looking to make a new start. The war industries flourished in Chicago, and the African-American population increased by 148%, taking advantage of the new opportunities. Among the thousands who joined the Great Migration North was a young trumpeter by the name of Louis Armstrong, who followed his mentor King Oliver and his Creole jazz band to Chicago in 1922. Armstrong's virtuosity on the trumpet was unparalleled. He was stronger, had a wider range, and was more articulate on his instrument than anyone else.
Is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me.
Whether singing or playing the trumpet, Louis taught musicians of every generation how to speak the language of jazz.
Every night while I shake with fight, cause my dynamite change your mind.
In 1920, prohibition would be the law of the land, but in Chicago and elsewhere, many people ignored the law. Prohibition gave the nightlife in Chicago and the rest of the country its peculiar tone in the 20s. For the first time in the history of our country, the law of the land was openly flouted by a large part of its otherwise law-abiding citizens. Entrepreneurs and criminal gangs often joined forces to open nightclubs called speakeasies, where liquor, gambling, dancing, and jazz were the main attractions. This proved to be a boon for jazz musicians, suddenly in great demand. Duke Ellington knocked the door down to wider audiences and defied all musical convention. Born in Washington, D.C., he moved to New York in 1923, where an African-American cultural revolution known as the Harlem Renaissance was underway. Ellington embraced the scope of American music like no one before or after, synthesizing ragtime, the minstrel song, Tin Pan Alley, the blues, and European traditions into a singular expressive style. It's been said that at its best, an Ellington performance sounds as if it knows the truth about all the other music in the world and is looking for something better.